Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to virtual book launch program featuring Dr. Considine. And this is Kemal Budak. I'm a sixth-year sociology PhD student at Emory University. And it's my honor and pleasure to have Dr. Considine with us. This event is possible with the cooperation and collaboration of the Atlantic Institute and Istanbul Cultural Center. So we thank both our sponsors, so to say, and the organizers to make this event possible. First, I would like to say hi to Dr. Considine. Hello, Dr. Considine.
Greetings. How are you, Kamal?
Good. Thank you for joining. I wanted to say hi first before people stare at the screen for 5 minutes only seeing me. I wanted to make sure that you are also here with us. That's why I wanted to say hello. And then here's the plan, guys, for tonight. Before we start, I'll briefly talk about Dr. Considine. I'll briefly read his biography, and then I'll ask several questions about the book that he has just published, The Humanity of Muhammad, peace be upon him, and then we will take audience questions. Please try to maybe try not to write any questions during the maybe first 15 to 20 minutes, but once we pass the 20-25 minute threshold, you can write your questions. Of course, you can write your questions at any time, but we just want to make sure that they are not going to be disappearing up there. So because once the chat box goes down, sometimes some questions could be lost. Anyway, Dr. Considine, first and foremost, he's a colleague of mine. He's a sociologist like me. He's a scholar, professor. He's a professor at Rice University at Houston, Texas. And he's also a global speaker, media contributor, and a public intellectual. And he's the author of many books about Islam and Muslims, especially Muslims in America, or how the Islam is lived in the United States or in some diaspora communities. And Dr. Considine's opinions have been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, BBC. So you can count on all the mainstream news channels about Dr. Considine's opinions. And then he has also been invited numerous times to speak in many international organizations and colleges and universities all over the world. And he holds a PhD from Trinity College at the University of Dublin in Ireland, and MSc from Royal Holloway, which is part of University of London, and then BA from American University in Washington, D.C. And he's a Catholic of Irish and Italian descent. And if this was a physical event, I would probably continue as please join me in welcoming Dr. Considine. But unfortunately, since we are not going to hear any applauses, we are accepting your virtual applauses and hugs at this moment. But I'll start with my first question to Dr. Considine. When a non-Muslim, and especially a Christian, and in your case, you are a Catholic, when they write about Islam or Muslims, many Muslims immediately think, oh, another Orientalist or another Islamophobic person. But looks like, because I read the book, here is the book, The Humanity of Muhammad, you are outside of this generalization. So what drew you into not only writing this book, but also doing research about Islam and Muslims in general?
Okay, well, Kamal, first and foremost, thank you so much, my fellow sociologist. It's not very frequent that I come across sociologists who are thinking about similar themes that I think about and that live similar experiences that I live. I'd also like to thank the Atlantic Institute and the Istanbul Cultural Center for hosting this event tonight. So Kamal, I think you've actually made a good point here. And I don't consciously distance myself from the Orientalist mode and the Islamophobic mode. I think that's quite obvious that I'm not an Islamophobe, but I'm also not I do not consider myself an Orientalist. Like I think Orientalist kind of has a negative connotation in a way that, you kind of, how might we say it? You kind of look at the other in a mystical, exotic way, as if the Orient, whatever that might mean, I'm not even sure what that means, but like whatever that is, it's separate from us here in the United States. It's separate from, quote, us in Western civilization. And you can kind of go on with all these different categories. And to be honest, in studying the Islamic tradition, in studying Christian-Muslim relations, and in studying the life and legacy of Muhammad, I really don't see this kind of binary worldview thinking, that the Orient is something different, it's other, that Islam is something different and other. When I came to write this book, and it's quite obvious in the chapters of the book, where I dedicate time to the concept of religious pluralism, which I think is a concept which literally means the energetic engagement with religious diversity. But this concept has kind of been hijacked in a lot of ways by the so-called West and the United States. And if we actually go and dig deeper into the life of Muhammad, we know that at least this modern concept that we use and we conceptualize and we understand is also applicable to the year 630, halfway across the world, with a man, Muhammad, a prophet, who is actually not looked fondly upon in this part of the world, in the United States and in the Western tradition. I also dedicate a chapter in the book on this value of anti-racism. And, this idea of racial equality has, I think, also been hijacked by the United States. Now, we obviously have a very dark history in terms of race, and we're still dealing with the ramifications of that. But when you look at something like the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men, they mentioned men, but let me replace that. Let me amend that by saying all human beings. All human beings are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and those are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So when I take that value and I read the Declaration of Independence, and when I was a young man, these are the things that inspired me in terms of my own American identity. This is the type of vision of my country that I want to see come to fruition. I want America to be its best self. I want it to be a civic nation. This is what I'm striving for. And the beauty here is that you see a similar tradition in this broad topic that you call Islam, which has kind of been othered as not part of the American story, and which is not true. I mean, Muslims have always been living in this country, but you have these concepts that transcend civilizations, and they actually move across civilizations. This idea of a civic nation, religious pluralism, anti-racism. These make sense to me as an American. They make sense to me as a Christian, and they make sense to me as a scholar. I think that is the important part here, the objective part, where I'm able to see the beauty of my identities in the identities of religious traditions that, I have not historically had a close connection to.
And before we dig deeper into your book, I have another question, a general question about the book. According to a think tank, I forgot which one was it, but out of the top 25, so to say, Islamophobic people, only one of them has a degree about Islam, which is Daniel Pipes. He has a PhD at Harvard about Islamic civilization. All other Islamophobes or people who are acting like anti-Muslims, they don't know much about Islam and Muslims. and but unfortunately they spew a lot of hatred. So what kind of flavor you put into this book? What makes your book unique compared to its predecessors? Can you maybe summarize in a couple of themes or patterns, whatever you deem convenient?
Okay, so yeah, I think in a lot of ways, this book is kind of the antidote of the Islamophobia industry, but it's also kind of like a nightmare in a way for some of these anti-Muslim intellectuals who want to depict the Islamic tradition. And I use this term kind of loosely, the Islamic tradition. I don't like using the term Islam because it treats it as a monolith, as I don't like people using the term Christianity even. So yeah, this book is finding these parallels in history with our own national traditions in this country and linking it to the faith of a quarter of the world's population, which the Islamophobia industry is trying to denigrate. And members of this Islamophobia industry actually have the same type of interpretation and understanding of the Islamic faith as so-called radical groups do, right? So I often use the term two sides of the same coin in my class, and I use a loose binary of like you have a far right-wing organization, let's say like Act for America, run by Brigitte Gabriel, and they're pretty anti-Muslim. And when you see their criticisms of the Islamic tradition and Prophet Muhammad and the Quran and what verses they like to use in the Quran, and then you go to the opposite end of the spectrum and you look at what some of these fringe so-called radical groups who happen to identify as Muslims, what they use in terms of their intellect, they have the same understanding. And so the book, in many ways, is not only a counter to the Islamophobia industry, it's also a counter to the narratives that are coming out of certain very rigid, very puritanical interpretations of the Islamic faith, right? So people often ask me, how do you connect with other Christian readers? And do you write your books for Christian readers? And I really don't. I have humanity in mind when I'm writing my books. And when I see plagues on humanity, which are extremism, and it doesn't matter necessarily where extremism comes from, it's still extremism, whether it's ISIS or whether it's a white supremacy group in this country. And these are the entities that feed off of each other. They have the same worldview. It's a very puritanical worldview, and they happen to have the same interpretation of Islam. And these are the people that dominate the headlines. These are the communities that unfortunately are also driving our politics at the moment. So, the book in a lot of ways is an antidote to these unfortunate, if you want to call it radical or polarizing entities in society. And I could speak a little bit too about writing this book as a Christian. And what we see in the Islamophobia industry are individuals who identify themselves as Christian. And I'm not going to be one to question their religious identity. If they say they're Christian, okay, that's fine. But I find it very, very difficult to reconcile some of the narratives that are coming out of the Islamophobia industry of people who happen to be Christian with the gospel. And the first 4 books of the New Testament obviously can be interpreted in multiple ways. But one of the overarching themes, and I think this is a trend across the scholarship, is that Jesus was trying to transcend these type of divisions that we see in society. I mean, he's talking about not only loving your neighbor, but loving your enemies. So if we have people in the Islamophobia industry who happen to be Christian and they're hating on Muslims, and they're denigrating Muslims, and they're creating content that is creating hate crimes against Muslims. You know, we have a serious crisis within Christianity. It's not even about Christian-Muslim relations. It's a issue within Christianity that Christians in this country need to clean up, and I'm trying to do that in my work.
Thank you so much. You mentioned several key concepts. In this book, like religious pluralism versus religious tolerance, etc. And I'm going to come to that in a minute. But before that, I would like to lay the background of this whole discussion with a technical question, so that our especially non-Muslim audience can comprehend what Muslims mean when they put the adjective prophet in front of Muhammad, peace be upon him. Because sometimes I also teach some classes or give speeches at different occasions. The word prophet is a very problematic word in terms of describing the prophets in the Quran. Because in the Islamic tradition, the prophet is a perfect person. They are infallible. They can't even commit a sin according to Muslims, even if they want to. But in the Judeo-Christian theology or tradition, when we say prophet, and by the way, many prophets in the Quran are given different names, such as patriarch, just a non-Israelite person, or kings, or church father, also prophets. So this is a very encompassing word. And these people, their stories, many biblical prophets in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, they are pretty much immune to some errors and mistakes, if not sins. So when you write something, a very positive book about Muhammad, some people think that, hey, this book's like a propaganda because he just praises and lauds Muhammad. But can you please elaborate on the term prophet from an Islamic perspective, so that we can understand not only the Muhammad from an Islamic perspective, but also maybe King David, Joseph, Jonah, and all the other biblical prophets from the Islamic perspective? I think this is a very, very important background question you should answer maybe.
Yeah, so a lot to cover with this one. Before I answer that direct question too, I definitely want to get back to the context in terms of why some kind of so-called non-Muslims don't want to recognize Muhammad as a prophet. I think that's an important issue. But okay, so, you know, typically when I would be dealing with a Christian audience, I think one of the most important points to kind of hammer home when we talk about Muhammad is that Muhammad is part of a larger Abrahamic monotheistic family that is rooted in the Quranic term of al-Kitab, or people of the book. So according to the traditional Islamic perspective, all of the prophets recognized in the Old and New Testament, Jesus essentially, are indeed prophets. And Muhammad is not coming necessarily on a different line of all of these prophets. He is merely a continuation of these prophets, in the sense that they were delivering the same exact message, and it's a monotheistic message. And there's other kind of similar features that we can fit underneath that, you know, the idea of the day of judgment, the belief in Holy Scripture, key features like mercy, compassion, and so on and so forth. So Muhammad is really quite close to Christianity in many ways, even though there is speculation and the argument that Muhammad actually kind of erases the idea of Christianity, because the Islamic tradition, you know, does not share the same ideas of Jesus's life. You know, that's a Christological issue, and probably the topic of another conversation. But I think the important thing for people to consider here who may not be familiar with the Islamic tradition is that Muhammad is part of a wider family. And this family includes Mary, Jesus's mother, the only woman in the entirety of the Quran that has an entire chapter named after her. And indeed, she's the only, there are several women mentioned in the Quran, but none by name outside of Mary. Jesus shares, as I mentioned, many close similarities in the Islamic tradition as he is understood in the Christian tradition, being the Messiah. Maybe there's differences over his divinity, but he's still a prophet, and Muslims recognize that. Then we go even farther back, King David, Moses, Abraham, Adam, and all on down the line. And it's a very basic point, and it may seem like overly simplistic, but I think a lot of Christians actually in this country and many so-called non-Muslims don't understand that the Islamic tradition is actually part of the same tradition. And that's why I take issue with the concept of Judeo-Christian that we often see in kind of political discussions, like America was founded on Judeo-Christian values. I mean, if you're going to use that term, you have to extend the tent even further, because the Islamic tradition is basically absorbing that as well. And Muhammad was very clear about this. He said, according to the sources that are available to us, he's like, I'm really not coming with anything new. I'm coming as the seal. I'm coming as the person to remind everyone what all the prophets before me said. That's essentially what Muhammad was doing. You know, he was a messenger, yes, but like I like the concept of a reminder is an interesting term to use. He was reminding people about these monotheistic messages, these divine messages coming from God that have been lost. And, you know, if you want to get into the history, this was not written or covered in this book, but in research that I was carrying out this summer, getting into the Christological debate and the early debates about who Jesus was. And Jesus was not, for the Christians out there, he was not always divine. He was not always the Son of God. And Muhammad is essentially coming as a prophet and saying, yes, we recognize Jesus, we believe in Jesus, but we have a slightly different understanding of him. And I think that's fair. I mean, I think that's constructive. I mean, at least he's recognizing, you know, it's not like he's condemning or any of this. The other point I want to raise really quick, Kamal, is when you have individuals who happen to be, let's say, Christian or non-Muslim, whatever term you want to use, and they denigrate Muhammad, I think a lot of the misunderstanding that comes out of discussions on whether Muhammad should be a prophet is based on lack of context. And this is largely due, I think, to the fact that the Quran was revealed in a linear fashion, and it was revealed in certain moments in Muhammad's life. So when Muhammad had friction with the Jewish community in Medina, with the tribes, some of the Jewish tribes in Medina, and there are verses of the Quran that are talking about Jewish people, the Quran is not saying that Jewish people as a whole for eternity should be condemned. The Quran was talking about a given moment. And if we step back and we understand the social context in which the Quran was revealed, and we understand why Muhammad was making the decisions he was making, I think then Christians could hopefully see, okay, now I understand why someone even like me would be able to consider him a prophet.
Excellent points you brought on. And also, I was going to ask you the similarities between Jesus and Muhammad, and I think you also addressed partly to that issue. And that way we can, I think, definitely move on to those key concepts I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. You talk about in the book that there is, especially getting inspired by Dr. Eck, Diana Eck from Harvard, university, and how she differentiates between religious pluralism and religious tolerance. And you argue in the book that Prophet Muhammad was actually practicing religious pluralism. Could you please elaborate on that a bit?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that, Kamal. Diana Eck is a scholar at Harvard University. She is one of the main driving factors behind the Pluralism Project. So if you're interested in what I'm about to say, definitely visit the Harvard University Pluralism Project. That is a plug. I have no connection to Harvard. I'm just saying I admire this website. So Eck, her fundamental argument is that this concept of tolerance is quite similar to having a loved one, let's say a son or a daughter or a parent, and they have a bad habit, and you tolerate it. So you never really engage with it, right? Like you never look for a solution. You never look for maybe a way around it or a way to counter it. You tolerate it. You put up with it. And in the context of relations among religious people, when you just say, okay, these people do these things because their book tells them to, and we're going to let them do it, there's no real meaningful understanding or engagement there. And Eck is saying when we merely tolerate people, it doesn't encourage us necessarily to have the difficult conversations. It doesn't encourage us to dive deeper into the knowledge. And because tolerance enables this kind of standoffish mentality, there's the probability that stereotypes are going to be reproduced because people aren't interacting enough. They're not trying to grapple with some difficult things. So she encourages us to engage in the energetic engagement with religious diversity. That's kind of the overarching difference between tolerance and pluralism. It's active. A person engaging in religious pluralism is, visiting places of worship, having difficult conversations, going to people's houses, sharing food, breaking bread, having scriptural classes. Tolerance is good, but it's not enough. That's what Eck is saying. So Muhammad was definitely moving beyond tolerance. I think a fundamental feature of the Islamic tradition as a whole is tolerance. I mean, I mentioned earlier, al-Kitab, people of the book. Like, it is at least at a very rudimentary level tolerating the presence of Christianity and Judaism within this larger monotheistic tradition. But we have specific examples from Muhammad's life where he's moving beyond mere tolerance, that he's moving into this active realm that is good, not only for the Ummah and Muslims, but it's good for interreligious relations. And I focus primarily on several stories. Like the book is like 152 pages, but there's not, I don't focus on a ton of stories. All we need is a few stories to understand big picture. And the example I use in the pluralism chapter is around 630, Muhammad was emerging as a state leader, not merely as a prophet, but as the head of state, essentially. And he was sending treaties and letters and correspondences to various rulers in the region. And he sent one to the Christians of Najran, which are a Christian community which was likely in that area of the Arabian Peninsula for 200 to 300 years, I would say, based on my research. And Muhammad invites them to Medina. And when they arrive to Medina, the mosque doors open to this Christian community. And inside the masjid, there was a constructive and perhaps even a difficult conversation on Christology, on the nature of Jesus. And as you can imagine, the Christians of Najran were likely talking about Jesus's divinity. And Muhammad was saying, well, listen, according to these revelations, this is what Jesus means to us, but we differ in terms of his divinity. And essentially, the two sides agreed to disagree, and that's fine. They saw eye to eye. But that is more than tolerance as well. I mean, letting the Christians into the masjid is tolerance, but they started talking. And then Muhammad took it even further when, and this is according to legitimate sources, when the Christians of Najran wanted to leave the masjid to go pray in the streets of Medina outside Masjid al-Nabawi, Muhammad actually invited them back in and told them that they could use this space to pray. Now, I want to be clear here, like, I'm not bringing this point up to necessarily blend Christianity and Islam, and I'm not suggesting that Muhammad thought Christian prayers are the same as Muslim prayers. That's not what this is about. This is about, how do you treat your guests? How do you treat your guests? Do you want your guests to feel whole, to feel welcome, to feel loved, that they can be themselves in your environment under your watch? And Muhammad knew deep down, as a human being, that's important. It's really important to allow people to do that. And he did it. And another way in which he engaged in this idea of pluralism, the energetic engagement with religious diversity, back in 615, during the first Hijrah, where he is encouraging his believers who are being persecuted to risk everything in their life, leave their homes, get on a boat, cross the Red Sea, and go to Abyssinia, because it's in Abyssinia where the Abyssinian King Ibn Abjar, most people refer to him as the Negus, which is the local Ethiopian term for king. And Muhammad said, go there, he'll take care of you. And it's an amazing story, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but King Ibn Abjar not only welcomed the early Muslim refugees in, but he defended them in front of the Quraysh in his court. I mean, to me, that is a form of the energetic engagement with religious diversity. It's not so much you're sharing religious texts or you're letting people pray into in your place of worship, but this is like on a deeper, bigger level where you're actually defending the rights of people because you see that there's a similarity there, and that's really powerful. This form of allyship.
You again brought up valuable points, Dr. Considine. By the way, guys, our audience, please feel free to share your questions in the chat box or the comment section, and we will start answering them in a few minutes. Before I go with another term you discuss, I would like to ask you a kind of honest question on this religious pluralism versus tolerance dichotomy, so to say. As a Muslim, I also find this a little bit like self-criticism. Where did we Muslims do wrong by not practicing the same or similar things Prophet Muhammad practiced 1400 years ago? Because let alone religious pluralism, unfortunately, in some parts of the world, in some Muslim majority communities, there's not even religious tolerance, let alone religious pluralism. And some of these non-religious tolerance or intolerance are practiced by people who claim that they love Prophet Muhammad so much. How come they love Prophet Muhammad so much, but they act otherwise?
Big question. The first thing that came to my mind was the dangers of nationalism. And I think nationalism as a kind of modern phenomena really tries to orient nation state building and the idea of like the imagined nation around race and ethnicity. And I think these two issues, race and ethnicity, have been very, very divisive. And they have really torn us away. And I mean us as, people of conscious believers in God, they've really torn us away from the big picture of God, which is the creator of all races. We are all part of his creation. And this is really a form of humanity, fundamentally. So, I mean, that's the initial reaction that I had, that people aren't willing. I mean, even within the Islamic world at the moment, obviously there's so much sectarianism. But I am also very concerned with the role that nationalism is playing in our current political discourse in the United States. And I'm concerned that this form of nationalism is kind of being infused with racial and ethnic components, where we start having questions about, who are the real Americans, who are the true Americans? And these bring up racial connotations. And we know in the Islamic tradition and in the American tradition as well, but in the Islamic tradition, we had a vision of the Ummah that was not only non-racist, which I talk about in the book. It's not only non-racist. So to be a non-racist is a person that does not hold racist beliefs. But Muhammad was an anti-racist. Fundamental difference. Like, just as we have a difference between tolerance and pluralism, right? Tolerance is standoffish, pluralism is active, and you go out there and you engage. Non-racist is also passive. You can sit at your home and hold views of racial equality, but you don't go out in the streets, you don't defend your friends who happen to be people of color, and so on and so forth. Muhammad was actually an anti-racist. He's energetically engaging in the dismantling of racial superiority in the early days of the Ummah. So, when we talk about that vision, I mean, that not only for me breaks down the issue of race and making all races equal, but like, I also think Muhammad would extend that as well to freedom of thought within certain realms. But yeah, that's kind of a different subject as well. Freedom of conscience. But yeah, for some reason I thought nationalism.
Dr. Considine, I think you have an extraordinary ability of predicting my next questions. Always you already mentioning my or answering and responding to my next question, which was about going to be, non-racism versus anti-racism. And you already mentioned this, but could you please also give one example from the life of Prophet Muhammad where he showed his anti-racist attitudes?
So I'll give three really quick. First and foremost is the relationship that he forged with Bilal ibn Rabah. Some of you may know Bilal, one of the most important earliest companions of Muhammad and the believers. Bilal was a darker skinned fellow from, I believe his mother was from Abyssinia. His father was a local Meccan, and he was raised into slavery, and he was an early believer in Muhammad's message. And Muhammad ends up defending him to the extent of actually buying his freedom. And Muhammad essentially liberates him on behalf. I think Muhammad had Abu Bakr literally hand the money over to Bilal's slave owner. I mean, so that's a very obvious point. I mean, he's literally buying people's freedom. What could be more liberating or anti-racist than that? I think the second example, and I actually didn't include this in the anti-racism chapter, but I think it's applicable. I think the Constitution of Medina, which was essentially entered in 622, is an act of anti-racism in itself. Different type of anti-racism. This anti-racism is actually happening at the macro level, at the governmental and political level. And Muhammad was doing something absolutely unheard of at the time. He was making a confederation of human beings that belonged to different communities that also included members of different races, ethnicities, and religions, which was not happening anywhere near the Arabian Peninsula. And to be fair, I don't think anywhere within close proximity with the Byzantines and the Persian Empire. So Muhammad is creating a new vision for societal order. He's basically saying what makes you belong to this Medinese nation, if we can call it that, is not the color of your skin, not the texture of your hair, not the beliefs that you hold dear to you in your heart and your soul. What makes you belong is this document that we agreed upon. It's a set of principles, political principles. And this is where I compare it to America. Because again, this country, if you read the Declaration of Independence, is anti-racist. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. All human beings are created equal. That's anti-racist. But, you know, Muslims throughout history, Christians throughout history, and Americans throughout history have struggled in implementing this. And then lastly, real quick, the farewell sermon is also an act of anti-racism in the sense that this was Muhammad's final audience with his people. And he mentioned here that an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, a white has no superiority over a non-white, a black has no superiority over a non-black, except in piety and good action. And I'll end this little segment on this. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the most important Christians in the history of the United States and one of the most important Americans in the history of the United States, was on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, 1963, and he gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And he says that, I'm paraphrasing, "I hope that one day my children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." It's literally almost like he's holding up a mirror to the Constitution of Medina. So these are powerful examples that not only help build a bridge between America and all the other nations of the world, but between civilizations and between even Muslims and Christians.
Also, with your permission, I would like to give one more example,
Please.
which is a great example about his anti-Semitic stance. Once one of his wives, and by the way, Prophet Muhammad never practiced polygamy until he was beyond his 50s. And he was loyal to his very first wife, Khadija, for like 22, 23 years. Most of his later or subsequent marriages were mostly like political purposes so that he can make Islam enter people's heart, because tribal connection and affiliation was a big thing. Anyway, so one of his wives, and during this process, he got married to a Jewish woman as well. Her name was Safiya, as you well know. And one of her wives called that woman Jew, and she complained it to Prophet Muhammad, and he told her that when they call you again Jew, tell them that my father is Moses, my uncle is Aaron, and my husband is Muhammad. What else honor? What kind of honor should I ask for? And according to some reports and narrations, he didn't speak to that wife who made some anti-Semitic rewards for a couple of weeks or months. So this was a kind of serious attitude by Muhammad that he basically and explicitly said that there can't be any anti-Semitism in this household. He made sure that there is no anti-Semitic remarks going on. And there is
three quick points, Kamal. Do you mind?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Okay, don't mean to interrupt, but yeah, in addition to Safiya, he also married Miriam, a Coptic Christian from Egypt. Interestingly, the example that you gave, Kamal, with Muhammad kind of stepping in and correcting one of his followers and saying, you know, don't identify this woman as merely like a Jew, like she's more than that. And one of the examples that we have in Muhammad's relationship with Bilal ibn Rabah is actually almost identical. When Abu Dar al-Ghafari literally said the same thing to Bilal. He said, you know, you're the son of a black woman, kind of pointed at him. And Muhammad said, you are still stuck in the age of ignorance, the age of Jahiliyyah. And that age was racism. You know, Muhammad came to eradicate that. And then the last example I wanted to bring, like anytime this issue of anti-Semitism is brought up in light of Muhammad's life, I think about the story in which the Jewish funeral procession was passing by. And historical sources relate that Muhammad stood up when a Jewish funeral procession was going by. So a Jewish person had passed away and people were walking the person through the street. Muhammad stood up, and one of the believers, his companions to either side of him, said, why are you standing up? This person's Jewish. And Muhammad says, is this person not a human life? I mean, if that's not anti-racist, you know, when you start identifying people as humans before any other category, that's a good start in terms of wanting to be anti-racist, you know, understanding and respecting the fundamental human dignity that each and every single person has. That's what Muhammad had. That's what Jesus had. That's what a lot of great people in this world have had.
Yes, well said. Thank you so much. I see two questions in the comment section, and both questions came from two of my dear friends. But I'd like to say ladies first, and I'd like to take first Ferial's question. She asks, I encounter this question during interfaith dialogue events a lot. So do Muslims and Christians worship the same God?
I would say yes, but I can understand why people say no. And the reason why I say yes is it's almost kind of creating an essentialist view of our faiths. So essentialism means something quite, you know, broad and abstract. We Christians, Jews, and Muslims believe in monotheism, even though a lot of Muslims think that the Trinity constitutes polytheism. But like, I really have not met a lot of Christians that say that they believe in multiple gods. You know, they're monotheists. It's a different manifestation of God. Now, in the Islamic tradition, there's also a different manifestation of God. God is a lot more isolated in the Islamic tradition. It's kind of one and only, and it's God, and that's it. No partners. But, you know, I mean, we can focus on the things that kind of trickle down from this big idea. But at its core, like we believe in that oneness. We believe in that monotheistic tradition. We, I think, disagree on God's manifestation, how God expresses himself or herself or itself, whatever you want to call it. And I also think, you know, the Islamic tradition coming after Christianity, even though I understand the comment that Islam is, you know, the pure religion and it's coming before all of these terms. I think fundamentally, Islam is not coming necessarily to supplant. And I mentioned this earlier. It's coming to remind. And again, we get into a tricky game over Jesus's divinity. But as a Christian, I'll say this. I don't believe that you need to be a believer in the Trinity to be a Christian. I believe in the Trinity because I've recognized and I've felt its manifestation. I obviously believe in God. I love Jesus and I admire Jesus, and I've felt the Holy Spirit. So it's real to me. But I don't think it needs to be a requisite of faith. Because if you dig into the history, the Trinity is largely coming out of some intense theological debates of the early church fathers and the Council of Nicaea in 325. I mean, that's the first time that the Trinity was kind of indoctrinated. But at the end of the day, we still go back to God. Despite these differences, we still go back to God. We still go back to a higher power that has control over all of us, that we as human beings will have to answer to on the day of judgment. The day of judgment is actually quite important here. And then, of course, I mean, with the Islamic tradition, recognizing all prophets that come before it is definitely a good argument in the sense that we all worship the same God. One of the tasks that I'm trying to accomplish is making Muhammad more familiar to Christians so they can not necessarily just dismiss him, and I'm not even trying to get Christians to recognize him as a prophet. They don't need to say that, but at least respect, at least respect can kind of contribute to more harmony. So I think those are some of the big issues that come to mind when I think about this question of whether we worship the same God. I would say yes, but I understand where people deviate.
Yes, good point. I have one question, and we have two questions I can see in the comment section. And my question is pretty much related to what you have said. So unfortunately, I have to prioritize my question because it's a kind of personal question that you briefly mention in the book, that some Muslims, for example, I was assuming, and I thought after reading the book, I said, okay, I was right, because some Muslims invited you to Islam. And then this was my assumption, and unfortunately my assumption came true, because they sincerely believe that they are, and this is also your paraphrasing, I'm paraphrasing you as well, because they are trying to save you from the hellfire. Yeah. And on the other hand, some Christians were saying to you that, hey, what kind of Christian are you by accepting Muhammad either as a prophet or maybe writing or talking about, saying good things about him? Look like you are in limbo because you are not good Christian enough and you are not Muslim enough. Yeah. But you, according to some extremist people on both sides, you are in limbo. How do you tackle with such in limbo situations?
I actually embrace it. I love the limbo state. And a way of thinking of the limbo state is a Venn diagram. So everyone should be familiar with a Venn diagram. That space in the middle of a Venn diagram is the space of overlap. It's the space of confluence, of agreement, and of synthesis. And for me, I find this gray zone space. That's really what it is. It's a gray zone. It's neither here nor there. You're actually a part of, in some ways, you're a part of both. And I think that is a really kind of deep theoretical idea, that you can kind of be part of multiple communities at the same time. And there's nothing wrong with that. And what's dangerous here is that this gray zone that I'm talking about, this is a space, again, it's a space of confluence, but it's a space where like identity categories get a little blurred, where people are like, and I get this all the time, people are like, are you Muslim? And, I usually don't answer questions like that, but I almost take it as like a sign of respect, that like I'm able to be true to myself. I'm able to be true to my upbringing, my faith, my religious identity, and my nationality. And I believe in these things and I express it. And then there's other people who do not fit into these categories that I hold and say, hey, that actually makes sense. That's me. That's me. That's what we need, I think, in this world. So this gray space zone is in danger. And, you know, to be precise with this, ISIS back in 2014, I want to say, in their propaganda magazine called Dabiq, they literally devoted an entire volume of their propaganda magazine to destroying the gray zone. They want Christians to hate Muslims, and they want Muslims to hate Christians. The biggest threat to these people are people who operate in the gray zone, people who are able to be themselves, navigate successfully in and out of different religious communities, and be content with holding multiple identities. You can be Christian and American and Irish and Italian all at the same time, and even throw some Islam in there too. Sure, why not? You know, even someone asked me the other day, do you believe in Islam? And I actually said, yes, I actually do. Am I a Muslim? No. But my understanding of Islam is not very different from Christianity. It's rooted in monotheism and all these traditions. And I don't expect anyone else, and I don't expect myself, to believe in everything within a given religious tradition. It's just not kind of part of how my mind operates. But yeah, finding ways of linking yourself up to other identity categories and being able to blend these things in a way that creates harmony, social cohesion, and brotherhood and sisterhood. This is what we need in the world.
Excellent points. For those who just maybe logged into or connected to the live stream, we are talking about The Humanity of Muhammad by Dr. Craig Considine. And we have around roughly 15 minutes or so. And so I'd like to speed it up a little bit so that I can ask all the questions in the chat. So far, I see 3 of them. So in chronological order, I'll start with Kamal, who is my namesake, who asked this question: what would you recommend people to do to get to know Prophet Muhammad as a human being? And the name of the book also is Humanity of Muhammad.
It is. You know, I mean, the first thing I would say, and a lot of people disagree with me on this, is to actually interact with people that believe in him and that follow his model and his method. I feel like I've had a lot of enlightening experiences with people who happen to be Muslim, who have shown me immense respect, immense hospitality, and even going beyond that, you know, deep appreciation, genuine appreciation and love. And when I read about Muhammad, which is an important part of getting to know Muhammad through the books and reading the right books, which is important. But you have to supplement that with human experiences and human interactions. You know, you can't really truly understand a phenomenon like Muhammad's life and legacy without seeing it through the people who follow him. And I think this is really important. But then again, you know, not everyone has the same perception of Muhammad's life. And that's when we kind of get into a dicey game. So if I'm telling people, hey, the best way to know Muhammad is to get to know Muslims, I mean, I think that's generally true, but Muslims are not a monolith. You're going to get a lot of Muslims that may directly challenge Muhammad's vision. But generally speaking, I think it's actually an interesting question. I would love to see an event held by, let's say, a Muslim family in a house, and you say, let's have an event one night in which we basically replicate Muhammad's life, and how would he carry out this event in our life? I think that would be a really interesting kind of little experiment. It would be, I think, filled with love, with compassion, understanding, and all of these things that kind of remind us of our common humanity. But I think fundamentally, first and foremost, go to people, speak to people, interact with people, and see how his life and his legacy is lived, not just written about, but lived.
Thank you. We have another question, this time by somebody whose last name is Kemal, H. Kemal. And he says, or she, I don't know, could you please talk about Hilf al-Fudul, which is the League of the Virtues? I think the foundation and the organization at the time of Prophet Muhammad.
So when I think of this league, I often think of the Hanifa and the Hanifs. So according to Islamic tradition and according to many sources, there was a very small group of individuals who had monotheistic inclinations, that they may have been influenced by certain Christian and even Jewish traditions. And the way the sources kind of communicate this is that, this monotheistic inspiration really encouraged them to embrace this kind of oneness of humanity, transcending the tribal divisions, transcending the materialism that we saw in Mecca at the time around the revelations, to transcend narrow views of religion. So this league was really a precursor to the relationship that Muhammad later forged with some of the key believers. And I think fundamentally this league was promoting issues like, or taking stances that were anti-racist, that were much more tolerant than the status quo at the time. And, I actually did a lot of research this summer on the Hanifa. Waraka ibn Nafal comes to mind specifically, but I don't want to give too much away of my forthcoming research. But another thing I wanted to add, in addition to the Hanifa in the league that we're talking about too, is in my research over the summer, I learned about the people of the bench. And Martin Lings, in his biography of Muhammad, speaks about the people of the bench. And this was essentially, bench refers to an actual bench at the Masjid al-Nabawi in Medina. And it was kind of a portion of the masjid center in which people kind of came and went, and they weren't maybe necessarily 100% part of the Ummah and what Muhammad was advocating for in terms of religious practice, but they were there almost in spirit and in solidarity. And Muhammad made sure that these individuals were taken care of, that their basic needs were met, that they were treated with basic respect and dignity. And I think that's ultimately what the League was really getting at, that kind of common core humanity.
I'll immediately move on to the next question because Dr. Considine has another commitment. So roughly in like 9 or 10 minutes, we have to finish this beautiful conversation. The next question is, if we think of the wholeness of humanity, can you speak to the divinity of the non-teleologic cosmogony of Buddhist and Hindu tradition?
Buddhist and Hindu.
Yeah.
Oof. Part of me just wants to humbly disconnect from that question because I don't want to give y'all some information that may not be accurate. But I will say this, I'm definitely not a scholar of either one of those traditions. But a part of me does think that while Muhammad may disagree with their kind of ultimate theological claims, I do think that there's plenty of evidence in the available sources about Muhammad's life that he really did care a lot, not just about faith, but also of action. And if there are people who self-identify as Buddhist or Hindu, Muhammad may wish and advocate that they embrace a monotheistic inclination. I think he would still extend the hand of brotherhood and sisterhood and respect and dignity if people are doing good deeds and people are doing good works. So I think while he was very stern with his theological positions, I think, that was his conviction. That was his experience with God through revelation, through Gabriel, and so on and so forth. I mean, what do you expect him to do? I mean, he's going to believe this, but he wasn't necessarily just writing other things off. I mean, there's so many examples, and we touched upon some of them tonight. There's so many examples where he understands that there are other cultural processes, other religions around him that do share similar values, and that these potential values are linkages between communities that can be embraced and that they can ultimately be constructive. So I'm sorry for the person who asked that question. I apologize if I'm blatantly not talking about Buddhism and Hinduism, but I think my answer was it's a bit safe, and I want to leave it at that because I don't want to give you information that may be inaccurate.
Also, apologies on my side for not mentioning the name of the person who asked the question. His name was Michael Whitney. Thank you, Michael, for this great question. Next question. We have, I see two more questions, and we have only a couple of minutes. So imagine yourself on a limited CNN program where you have only a couple of seconds.
Gotcha.
So Rosario asked this nice question. How has Islam influenced or affected your Catholicism?
It's made me a better Catholic. It's made me a better Christian. For many years, I was at least a lapsed Catholic, if not a non-Christian. When I started studying the Islamic faith, I think it was 19 years old, and I was safely an agnostic, but in reflecting back, it may have even been an atheist. And when I started engaging with big theological principles found in the Islamic faith, it inspired me, and it reminded me of things that I had previously been given to leaders within my own community. So honestly, in many ways, and I've said this plenty of times before, like I often kind of recognize my studies in the Islamic tradition and my interactions with Muslims as actually bringing me back to my faith, which is interesting because that's essentially what Muhammad was doing, though he was kind of calling people to a new updated version of that. But in many ways, my experience, again, with Islamic tradition as a whole really triggered me to return back to my faith. And I think this is, it's important to talk about these things, obviously not because they're personal, but because I think they inform my research. And for me, like when I was an agnostic or an atheist, like I was not studying Islam to find answers to God. I was studying Islam to find answers to social issues. And it just so happened that in learning about current affairs through the lens of, the clash of civilizations and Christian-Muslim relations, that my spiritual side kind of ignited and was initiated. But I really don't think it would have happened without having Muslim professors in my life who really somehow got me to thinking that God is a lot bigger than I ever imagined. And it's a lot bigger than my Christian tradition. So, I mean, that's very abstract and that's very big picture, but that's the truth. And there are other things that I can mention too well, I'm supposed to do the CNN thing. I should stop. Let me stop there. But yeah, I think that's enough. Yeah, that's enough.
All right. There's an interesting question here. What event in Islamic history do you think is most appreciated by non-Muslims? And this question was asked by
Good
Al
question.
White Rose. Yeah, I also like the question.
That's a really good question. So it's what event in Islamic history should be best remembered by Westerners? Is that what it is?
Yeah, non-Muslims, yeah,
Okay.
or Westerners, you can say maybe.
Okay. I mean, man, I'm probably going to go back to the time of Muhammad here, and I would say there's a few. 615, when Muhammad encourages the early Ummah, the believers, to migrate to Abyssinia to be protected by a Christian king. 622, the second Hijrah, the migration to Medina, in which Muhammad creates the constitution of Medina with the Jewish and pagan tribes of that city, and they essentially create a civic nation. 630, we have the visit of the Christians of Najran to Masjid al-Nabawi, and that's where we saw the pluralism and the Christian prayer inside the mosque. And then 632, the farewell sermon. I actually think we need to go back, all the way back to these examples, because this is the root, this is the root of Islam. This is the root of everything. I think that's the best starting point. And, unfortunately, this is a really good question because nothing outside of those things come to mind. I mean, I can unfortunately think about some moments in history that are a bit more contentious, like 1453 sticks out, Constantinople falling. But yeah, we got to go back to the roots, to Muhammad. I think that's where we start.
Great. I think we only have 1 or 2 minutes at the most. First, one of our audience, he's congratulating you on Clarabella.
Oh, thank you so much.
Also, many congratulations on your newborn daughter. It's a blessing.
Thank you. It is. God is good.
Let me finish with this question because I know you need to go. Phyllis is asking this question. I really wonder if there is the Sunnah of Jesus, just like there is the Sunnah, the practices of Muhammad. So can you also enlighten us on this?
Okay, so I think there's enough in the gospel, the first core books of the New Testament. There's enough in there to really understand who Jesus was. But going back to my discussion of Christology and Jesus being divine, I think Christians need to be aware of how that so-called fact came about. And I often make the distinction in this way. There's Jesus of Nazareth, and then there is the Jesus of Christianity and Christ. And I think there's a massive difference there. If you go back to the gospel and you look at what Jesus did, talking about telling people to sell everything they have, to give it away to the poor, to open up doors to people that have been completely isolated, to befriend the Samaritans that most people hated, to not condemn prostitutes, even some of these people who are in the worst case scenarios. I mean, that is Jesus of Nazareth. That's who motivates me. That's who inspires me. Now, the Jesus of Christianity encompasses parts of this bit, but now we get into the Trinity. We get into the issue of divinity. Did Jesus say he was divine? Did he not? How did we come up with this idea of the Trinity, and so on and so forth? So for me, as a sociologist, as a Christian, but as a human being, I find more hope and inspiration in his actions, on what the sources say about how he carried himself in everyday life and conduct, and how he treated other people, not these big theological claims. I'm not interested in that necessarily. I mean, I am, but it's not as important as the example that he set for us.
And as a sociologist, I also echo all your sentiments here. Thank you so much, Dr. Considine.
Thank you.
I think this was a very fruitful and productive conversation. And I personally learned a lot from you in tonight's conversation. Dr. Considine's book, The Humanity of Muhammad, it is on sale, guys, on Amazon. You can just type the keywords and you're going to find the book, because it has become one of the best sellers. Congrats on that. And I also would like to thank our technical support team, Sumeira and Ümit. Thank you guys very much for supporting us during this live stream. And as Atlantic Institute and the Istanbul Cultural Center, we hope to have another conversation with you again, maybe in the future, maybe this time in a physical space. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kamal. God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good night, guys. Bye.